Hello, I am Paula Bennett and welcome to my New Zealand Herald podcast, Ask Me Anything. Now, one thing I've learned in life is it's never too late to learn something new. So on this podcast, I talk to people from all walks of life to hear about how they got to where they are and get some advice and guidance on some of life's biggest questions. An incredible story for you this episode. I am joined by author of Wavewalker, Suzanne Heywood. When she was just 6 years old, Suzanne's family set sail from England on what was set to be a 3-year around-the-world adventure. But 3 years turned into a decade and a life for Suzanne that lacked stability, a journey she describes as stealing her childhood. Suzanne is heading to New Zealand for next week's Auckland Writers' Festival and joins me now. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, very good to be talking to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for taking this time. I'm really excited about getting to know you a bit more and talk about that adventure. Now, a bit of housekeeping from me. 2 rules for our chat. First is I'm allowed to ask you anything, but the good news is you don't have to answer, because that's just one of life's, that's one of life's rules, I think. And the other one I think is quite normal as well, and I call this the safe space, so we do the no judgy zone. You be you, you be you and I'll be me. So to ease us in, quick fire questions. So reading the book, do you prefer Sue, Susie or Suzanne?
Suzanne.
And do different people from different times in your life call you different things?
They do indeed, because I was always called Sue on the boat. And when I left the boat, one of the things that I did, not immediately, but a little bit later, is I deliberately shifted back to my kind of full name, Suzanne. And for me, it's a little bit of a break with the past.
Yeah. And you defining your identity as to who you wanted to be. Yeah, I like it. Okay, are you a cook? Would you cook dinner? What would be your go-to meal?
Oh, well, all sorts of things. I love fish, which probably comes from living on a boat. Love soups, salads. I like cooking, actually, but I'm not a very elaborate cook. I'm a very kind of practical cook. I like to kind of cook things that don't take too long.
And if you could have anybody at that dinner table, who would it be?
Wow. Well, I have a few kind of questions for Captain Cook, as we will discover as we go on in the story. So perhaps Captain Cook, he has a bit of an explaining to do.
All right, let's chat about your book, Wavewalker, Suzanne, and the journey your parents took you on as a child. And then in the second half, I'd just love to sort of explore the impact it had on you and relationships. I've got to tell you, I couldn't put the book down. I am sort of known for being a bit of a speed reader and always in a hurry, and I did not do that with this. In fact, went back and reread paragraphs and even chapters at times because I sort of felt that I had rushed a bit and I wanted to explore it more. So thank you so much for writing the book and for taking me on that journey with you.
Well, thank you for reading it. I mean, I'm really happy that so many people have come on that journey because, as I'm sure we're going to find as we get into the story, there's some really interesting kind of messages and challenges that come out of it, as well as hopefully people finding it to be a great adventure.
Well, in the introduction, you say that you had excitement, frustration, and heartbreak. And I've got to say, reading it, I felt exactly the same. I felt all of those emotions and probably more. And, I found it quite incredible how you were able to portray that in the written word.
Well, I think most stories, most kind of real human stories will have kind of elements of all of those. And I think it would be wrong for me to portray my childhood as one-dimensional. It wasn't all bad. It certainly wasn't all good. I mean, there were some incredible moments of adventure, and I learned a lot. But overall, it became very, very challenging.
Okay, well, let's back up then and tell those that haven't read the story a bit about your story. So, you headed off to sea as a 6-year-old, weren't you?
Well, I was 6 years old when my father announced that he wanted to sail around the world. I was 7 when we actually set sail back in 1976.
And did it come out of the blue? You weren't expecting, like in your brother and yourself, you weren't expecting kind of here we go?
No, I wasn't. I mean, my father liked sailing, and he had a small boat that he used to sail off the south coast of England. And I'd even been with him. I mean, we'd been out for kind of short sailing trips across the English Channel on various bits like that. But I had no idea that he was going to want to sail around the world. And I was a little girl of 6, and when he announced this, I couldn't really conceive what that was going to be like. But he told me it was going to take 3 years and we were going to come back. Everything was going to go back to normal. I'd obviously have to leave everything behind, my dog, my friends, everything, but we were going to come back. And so it did sound like an adventure. And like a lot of little girls, I hero worshipped my dad. So I don't think I ever really questioned it too much. It was just going to happen.
So were both your parents behind the decision to go on the trip, or was it, I mean, it was predominantly your father's motivation, wasn't it, his adventure?
It was definitely my father's motivation, and that became kind of clearer as time went on. And, you know, his stated motivation was that he wanted to recreate Captain Cook's third voyage around the world. It was the 200th anniversary of that voyage. And actually, my maiden name is Cook, although I now know that we're not actually a relative, but my father comes from the same part of England. So it was really his motivation. He was really driven by this stated desire that he had, that he, you know, to kind of go and kind of recreate this voyage. My mother didn't really like sailing, but I mean, she was there. I mean, she wasn't openly questioning it in front of me. So she was definitely going to be part of it, but it was absolutely driven by my father.
Because she suffered seasickness, right? And quite regularly throughout the 10 years that you were, you know, on the yacht. I mean, she seemed to be sick just about every time you go on a new journey. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, I now realize, and I grew to learn about this over the years, you know, the amount of how seasick people get really varies person to person. So my mother was on the worst end. And that meant that every time we left port, she was pretty much seasick for the first 3 days, possibly, you know, kind of a little bit more. And she would take to her cabin for that time and just disappear and not come out. And I realized this the first time that we set out to sea from England. I mean, she just disappeared, leaving me and my brother basically kind of fending for ourselves in the cabin as we kind of hit the first of a whole kind of series of storms going down to South America. And we ended up just trying to look after ourselves. I mean, my father was steering the boat. My mother kind of disappeared, and we were just kind of clinging on and trying to figure out what we were going to eat.
Wow, and I mean, that is incredible in itself, right? Because your brothers are younger than you, so at 6 and 7 years old, you were, you know, literally alone for hours and hours at a time, and as you say, having to find food, make sure you had water, and get your own sea legs in the beginning, I imagine.
That's right. I mean, the funny thing is, and I try to write the book as honestly as I can, you know, from my, you know, perspective at that point in time. And, you know, people reading the book, they'll find in that kind of initial bit, I mean, there's lots of wonder for me about being at sea. And as the kind of storms quieten down and I start to see kind of birds at sea, and then we see a dolphin and flying fish, these are all rather wonderful. But from an adult's perspective, you look back at that kind of first voyage and I'm almost shocked, kind of realizing that we were just left on our own, trying to kind of work out what to do. We end up eating the cake that we were given just before we set sail. That's how we kind of keep ourselves going. Because my father, as I say, is up on deck, kind of steering the boat.
Well, at some level, I admire your mother for getting back on the boat, knowing that she suffers some seasickness, because I have suffered myself. I don't now, but it is a cruel illness. You know, like you feel like you almost want to die.
It is horrible, actually, and I'm very lucky because I inherit from my father a pretty kind of tough stomach. So I would feel queasy, but nowhere near as ill. Mm. But then you ask yourself, why would you go sailing around the world with your wife and 2 little kids when your wife gets very badly seasick? And then if you're the person who gets very badly seasick, why would you go? You know, why not kind of just fly and meet my father from kind of time to time? So yes, I agree. I have a lot of sympathy for that because it is a horrible feeling, but it was a decision that they both took. to do it like this.
Yeah, crazy. I can't get my head around that one, I've got to say. So there you go. Now, let's talk about the wave. And that was, from the journey from, you were, from South Africa going to Australia, weren't you? And, we talked about the wave. And that was a cyclone that came through?
Well, it wasn't actually a cyclone. So we went all the way down to South America, across to South Africa. And then, as you say, we were setting off across the southern Indian Ocean to Australia. And I should explain here that we were, compared to most around the world sailors, certainly kind of cruising sailors, we were sailing the wrong way around the world. Most people who are doing this on a kind of cruising basis, they sail the other way round from east to west, because then you can sail around near the equator and generally you don't hit very bad storms. But unfortunately, because we were following Captain Cook, he went the other way on his third voyage. So he went from west to east. And going west to east means sailing really far south. And so we were sailing across one of the most dangerous oceans in the world, which is the southern Indian Ocean. And several days out from Cape Town, we were hit by an enormous storm. I don't actually think it was a cyclone, but frankly, it was just an enormous storm, and the waves built up and built up and built up. And finally, an enormous wave, according to my father, who was up on deck, curled up over the stern of the boat, smashed down through the deck, kind of smashed a huge hole in the deck out through the side, tipping the boat over on her side, flinging him into the water. And I was a little girl down below. I was still 7 years old at this point. We were only 6 or 7 months into our voyage. I was flung against the ceiling of the main cabin, against the wall, fractured my skull, broke my nose, was knocked unconscious, and kind of came to in a bunk in the forward cabin. And by that point, the boat's on the verge of sinking. We're filling up with water.
It's just absolutely staggering. So you're still miles from anywhere, right? You're in the middle of nowhere. There's the immediate danger that you're still in the storm. So I imagine that the adults are all doing what they're doing, and they pretty much put you in the bunk and then trying to keep the boat afloat. But you were badly hurt. You sort of said a fractured skull, and over the next few days, you progressively realised how serious it was. Your face was swelling, wasn't it? Your head was swelling. It was quite serious.
That's right. Remember, I'm a little girl, but what I remember is being in enormous pain. I got this incredible kind of swelling on my head. I also had a very bad cut on my arm, but my head was my kind of major injury. And we were in a very perilous situation. So, it wasn't, we're sailing at a time before satellite navigation, before any kind of proper way of kind of raising a mayday. There was nobody going to come and rescue us. We weren't sailing in a fleet. We were sailing on our own. So we were, it was very likely the boat was going to sink. We were lucky because 3 days later, we came across a tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, an island called Isle Amsterdam, which has a tiny French base on it. And I was very lucky because on that island, there was a doctor who was able to operate on my head, and kind of operated on my head kind of multiple times, 6 or 7 times. But unfortunately with no anesthetic, because there you are on a tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So that was also a horrific experience. And then the whole thing, both the wave, as I always called it, and the operations, of course, completely changed my understanding of the risk of this voyage. And after that, I'm actually really very afraid, particularly when we're in storms.
I was just staggered because it was something like 7 operations, wasn't it, that you had to relieve that swelling. And so in some respects, I was just absolutely appalled. But then, as you say, I'm pleased you used the word lucky, because I just thought, wow, coming across him, and he saved your life, ultimately.
That's right. This Dr. Senlart on this island, it was... He was the one who did the operations, and he didn't speak any English. I didn't speak any French. I'm a little girl. I can't speak any French. All I knew was one French swear word, and I'm afraid all the way through these operations, which I was kind of conscious for, I just kind of screamed the swear word at him. I mean, when I was writing the book, I tracked him down. He's now retired and kind of raising chickens in the kind of French countryside. And I was eventually able to thank him because he did save my life. As a little girl, I hated him. I mean, this man was just kind of causing me immense pain. And I did all those operations on my own because my mother refused to come in with me because she didn't like the sight of blood. So, they were very, very traumatic for a little girl.
Yeah, really traumatic. And then you were left on the island, weren't you, with your mother and your brother, and your father then sailed to Australia and you eventually hopped on a container ship to get there?
That's right. Yeah, the British and the French government decided that the boat was too dangerous for my mother and my brother and me to get back on board. So my father kept sailing on to Australia with the two crew that we'd had when we left South Africa, two novice crew. I mean, my father always preferred taking novice crew on board because then he could teach them how to sail and they wouldn't kind of tell him what to do. And then my mother, my brother and I, yes, we kind of caught a container ship eventually. We hitched a lift on a container ship and made our way to Melbourne and then finally reunited with him in Fremantle.
Okay, my question is, what was happening on Isle Amsterdam? Because when you were first going there, they said that there was a secret that was happening on the island, and I don't think you told us what it was.
Well, the thing is, I don't really know. I mean, it's a little French military base, I understand. Not very many men there. I mean, I'd kind of describe it as best I could. They were clearly doing scientific experiments on the island. They were sending up regular weather balloons. I don't honestly know what they were doing. In addition to that, we were told very strictly, that we couldn't walk off alone on the island. We were told that was for our own security. And I think, I mean, again, as a kind of small girl, I didn't really kind of question this. I was so relieved to be on land, petrified about these operations that I kept on being kind of taken off to have. But I was just relieved to be, on land and not on the boat. And effectively, I knew that by finding this island, it had saved my life. So it is a bit mysterious, I have to say. It's slightly kind of odd. But for those people who watched, there was a series called, I think it was called Lost. That always reminded me of Amsterdam. There was always something slightly mysterious about that island.
Oh, there you go. How hard was it to get back on Wavewalker?
Well, you see, what happened was by the time I got to Fremantle, the boat arrived after my mum and my brother and I arrived. And then, of course, it was tied up on next to a wharf. So that was okay. And then she came out of the water and it actually took several months to repair the boat. She was so badly damaged. So that was also okay because she was on dry land. But when I got fearful again was when we got back on board and we set sail. And for that voyage, we had a lovely member of crew on board, Mr. Ray, who I really bonded with as a little girl because, as your listeners may be gathering by now, my parents were not particularly kind of parental in the relationship that they had with me or my brother. They weren't very caring, really. But Mr. Ray was a lovely character, and he and I formed a very strong bond. But he remembers, and he and I are still close today, kind of looking at me as we set sail from Fremantle and seeing the kind of fear in my eyes as we set back out to sea again.
And so you then travelled to Sydney and then to New Zealand, but you didn't stay long in New Zealand that time, did you?
No, I mean, we went to a few different places. We went to Queen Charlotte Sound and we went to Wellington and Napier, up the coast, and then Auckland. So we were there for a few weeks, but not that long because we were basically making our way up. We had a real problem with the engine, so we ended up being stuck in Auckland for a little bit. But then we set off up the Pacific.
Up to Hawaii?
That's right.
And that took about 2 years, right? We're stopping at different islands and moving around. Yeah.
Yes. Well, by the time we got to Hawaii, we'd actually been sailing for 4 years. Wow. So, going all the way back to the beginning, my father originally promised the whole voyage was going to take 3 years and then I was going to go back to school. By the time we got to Hawaii, it was actually 4 years. So now I'm a little girl of 11. and I'm getting pretty fed up of being on a boat for 4 years. I'm not really getting any schooling. My mother had initially said that she was going to teach us, and she'd done a few kind of worksheets, but basically she'd given up long before then. I was really bored. I was starting to become a teenager. I wanted to be with friends. I wanted to be with school. I wanted to go to school. I wanted to start kind of learning. And my relationship with my mother was starting to deteriorate. I mean, she wasn't very happy on the boat anyway, but her and my relationship was starting to become very difficult. So my brother and I both voted to come home in Hawaii, but my father overruled us and said that his vote was the casting vote and we were going to keep sailing. And effectively, this kind of promise that we would come home after 3 years was null and void. We were just going to keep on sailing, with no end in sight.
And then you almost became like a tourist, didn't you? And you were taking on paid guests, if you like, for them to have the experience of going from island to island or to different places, and they were kind of expected to work on the boat, but you also had a big role in looking after them and feeding them and cleaning, and you were a child, right?
Well, that's right, because by this point, of course, we'd run completely out of money. I mean, we were never a wealthy family to start with, but what little money that we had all disappeared after the boat got shipwrecked and she had to be repaired. So in order to continue sailing, which was what my father became determined to do, we effectively had to turn the boat into a floating hotel. And that meant taking 5, 6, 7 crew on board at a time. And they would come on board to learn how to sail and to have a holiday. And I was expected to cook and clean for them with my mother. And I'm afraid the world on board Wavewalker was a very gendered world. So I was expected to kind of cook and clean for 5, 6 hours a day. I mean, there was a lot of work to be done. And my brother wasn't expected to do any of that. He was able to help up on deck, when he felt like it and when there was a need, but otherwise he wasn't, the same requirements weren't put on him. So that became my life, really, kind of working on this boat, kind of cooking and cleaning and sorting things out for these crew in order to fund this never-ending boat trip that just kept on going, and still unable to go to school and still unable to have kind of friends and do all the things that you would normally expect to be able to do by this point, as a teenager.
And so unhealthy in the relationships that you had. Like, as you say, your parents were, in my opinion, kind of consumed by themselves and what they were doing and each other, and not really interested in parenting you. And then you had these sort of sporadic friendships at times. You'd get close to someone because you'd be in port for 6 months or, and then, of course, they were then torn apart. Or those tourists, as you say, some of them you would get on well with, but you get to the point where you'd know everyone was leaving or you were leaving. And so that emotional attachment, and particularly I think for a teenage girl, and not having them just must have been extremely difficult.
It was extremely difficult because I think when you become a teenager, what you really want is you want friendships. You want people who you can spend time with. And increasingly you want to, start to separate yourself a little bit from the kind of family home. And you see, I was just completely stuck. So I'm stuck on this boat. A lot of the time I can't even go ashore because we're at sea. I mean, even if we're in port, I don't have anywhere to go because I don't have any kind of friends. And we're not going to stop for very long and then we're going to keep going. We have these crew on board. Some of them I do form friendships with, but it's very, transitory because they kind of come and go. And anyway, I don't have an address, so there's no easy way to kind of keep in contact with anybody. So you can see in the book that as time goes on, I actually become, I would now describe it as really quite depressed, and very isolated. But my parents have no real interest in any of that. I mean, they're very keen that they should keep sailing. They're very keen that I should kind of keep working. They're not at all really interested in the separate needs that my brother and I have to be children and to do all the things that you would expect a child to be able to do. But for me, the really interesting part of the story is that all of this is set in paradise, really. We're sailing around the South Pacific beautiful islands, palm trees. We sail past an exploding volcano. We have whales and dolphins. And there's this contrast between these beautiful places where we are and the reality of the life I was leading, which was, effectively kind of trapped on this boat for years.
But then just when I thought it couldn't get much worse, you end up in New Zealand. Your father supposedly has got a job that he's going to go to in Rotorua. So he puts your brother and yourself in a batch, effectively, on Lake Rotoiti, I want to say. And so they pretty much abandon you and you're left there. Your brother gets to go to school, you don't. And there you are raising your brother at the age of 17?
Well, I'm 16 and he's 50.
Wow.
So by that point, I've decided the only way to try and escape from this situation is to teach myself. And so I've enrolled myself into a correspondence school and I'm trying to teach myself. My brother does that a bit for a little bit, but then kind of gives up. So my parents decide he has to go to school. So they enroll him in a school in New Zealand, in Rotorua. And then the plan was that my father would stay with us. But at the last minute, he decides that he would prefer to keep sailing. And he and my mother just disappear, basically, and kind of go off sailing and announce that they're not going to be back for months. And we're left living in this batch, again, with this kind of incredible contrast between an absolutely stunning place for anybody who's ever seen Lake Rotoiti. It really is one of the most beautiful places in the world. But an incredible contrast between that and our actual circumstances, which is two little kids living on our own in a batch by the lake. We don't know anybody. So I don't know any adults in New Zealand apart from a friend of my parents who lives up in Auckland, several hours away. I'm not going to school, so I'm in this batch all day, every day on my own, apart from when I drive all the way to Rotorua to try and kind of buy food and wash some clothes because there's no kind of laundry facilities or anything at this kind of batch. And this goes on for kind of weeks and months. I've got very little money because my father only left a very small amount in a bank account, which I wasn't even in my name because I was too young to have a bank account. So I could only get that out by kind of forging his signature. I mean, really, it's quite an extraordinary situation now as a parent, kind of looking back on it. I just cannot understand how you could do that effectively to children. And on top of all that, I'm still on a British passport. So twice during that year, I almost get deported because, of course, the New Zealand authorities, quite understandably, cannot understand what on earth is going on and basically say that unless I can produce a parent, they're going to deport me. And both times I managed to get around that. My father kind of turns up at the last minute and then flies off again immediately afterwards. But I'm in a terrible situation. And I'm looking back, I'm very lucky that nothing kind of bad happened.
Yeah, you really
And in
are.
fact, we're completely on our own. I mean, all the New Zealanders who I meet, again, a lot of them very, not for a very long period of time. Actually, everybody is very kind, but I'm completely isolated.
Well, these chapters made me angry. These ones, I had other moments during the book where I was angry. Mm-hmm. I can't believe that your mother would be sulking and not talking to you for days and days on end on a boat. But this one, like you, my children are adults now. And I've always thought that they almost need you more, in those teenage years because, that's when everything's kind of going on for you. And I've always felt that that's one of those times when a parent should be most present. And so to try and comprehend how they left you and so alone and with such a huge responsibility was just absolutely, I say I can't kind of reconcile it, to be really honest, in my own head.
And I think in the book, that kind of period in New Zealand is where everything comes to a bit of a crescendo because, I finally realize, I think, in that kind of time in New Zealand that my parents really, don't have my best interests at heart. And that's a big realization for a kind of kid to make. And I almost don't say it, but I kind of find a friend who lives in a kind of caravan at the bottom of the road down from Lake Rotoiti, and she basically kind of, she's had a very tough childhood, and she drinks very heavily, and she pretty much kind of forces me to acknowledge this. And I don't really do anything about it. I mean, it's actually years before I really come back and kind of confront that. But what I do realize is I've got to get myself out of there. I mean, I can't rely on my parents to get me out of there. And the only way in which I'm going to get myself out of this situation and get on with my life is to educate myself and somehow get myself into university.
Look, Suzanne, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I'd really like to explore more about education and how that helped you with your escape. I think you're quite remarkable, the way that you taught yourself and went through it. So we will be back in just a couple of minutes. So you touched on it, Suzanne, earlier, but I want to sort of explore more around education. So you taught yourself on the boat, and often you would get correspondence papers, you would work your way through them, you would then post them. Were they going back to? No, they were Australian, weren't they? I was going to thinking they were going to England, but they were Australian predominantly, wasn't it?
That's right. So I managed to get myself registered at the Queensland Secondary Correspondence School, as it was then called. And that was catering for kids who were out in the bush or in prison, and then a few of us who were out on boats. And I mean, had I not managed to kind of register with that, I wouldn't have got an education. So I owe the school a huge amount. But it was a pretty tricky thing to do, because living on a boat, which was where I was to start with, we didn't have an address. Most of the time we were at sea. So, you're trying to kind of study in a kind of cabin that's tipping in all different directions. And of course, I'm expected to work on the boat, as I was talking about before, for kind of, multiple hours a day. So I was having to study in the fractions of time that I could escape, where I wasn't given kind of jobs to do. And I would normally do that by going and hiding myself up in the very kind of forward part of the boat where my mother couldn't find me, hide myself in a sail and try to study there. And then when we would hit a port, I would post off the lessons that I completed, and I would ask my father where we were going to sail to next and give that as my next address. But of course, many of the lessons never made their way back to me. So it was very difficult. And I don't remember ever talking to any of my teachers. I mean, in those days, of course, we're prior to the internet, so there's no way to kind of contact your teachers apart from through the post.
But both your parents were teachers, weren't they? And yet they didn't actually value your education. You had to almost fight to learn.
I know, and I think, one thing that I'm very passionate about is I know that there's a lot of people who feel very, very passionate about homeschooling. And had you asked my parents at the time, I mean, that phrase wasn't around then, but that's effectively what they would say they were doing. They would say, first of all, my mother was teaching me early on, and then later on they would say that they were supporting me in teaching myself. But the problem with these situations when a child is kind of pulled outside of the system is, of course, you don't know what's going on. So the reality was that they weren't at all. To be fair to them, kind of keeping a boat going, sailing, catering for these crew, maintaining the boat took up a lot of their time. And then what kind of time was left, they wanted to kind of relax and enjoy themselves. They didn't really want to have any kind of part of teaching me. And they really wanted me to be working, helping to kind of cater for these crew. But if you'd met them at the time, they wouldn't have said any of that. They would have said that, of course they supported me kind of getting an education. And that's one of the things I think for me, looking back on my childhood, is I've now had to come to terms with the fact that a lot of things that were said were not actually what was going on board Wavewalker.
Do you look back now, though, Suzanne, and absolutely acknowledge your strength and your self-determination to, A, actually educate yourself, and then what you did in nearly that year in New Zealand by yourself and with your brother is truly remarkable. And I just mean, looking back at that young self of you, I just couldn't get over that strength and that self-determination that you had.
So I do acknowledge that, but I also realize that, I'm very lucky. I've actually been diving into and trying to understand, the impact of these sorts of childhoods and the impact that they have on people. And there's been some really interesting kind of longitudinal studies, as they're called, kind of looking at children over prolonged kind of years and seeing what the impact is of very difficult childhoods. And the sad fact is that in most of these studies, and there was a very interesting one done with kind of kids in Hawaii, in most of these studies, about 3/4 of the kids are really, really badly impacted by, deprived childhoods where they don't get access to education. There might be alcoholism or drug taking or other things going on. So 3/4 badly affected. They don't have normal relationships. They don't kind of have normal careers and all of those things. 1/4 actually seem to come out of it okay. They have that kind of inner resilience to get through really quite difficult circumstances. And so I clearly was in that quarter. And so I guess I can take the credit for it to some extent, but I'm also incredibly lucky that I had that resilience inside me, because, a lot of people who are in that sort of situation don't come out of it. And one of the things that's happened since Wavewalker came out is I've been contacted by a lot of other people who've had very difficult childhoods, and quite a lot of them have been really badly, quite negatively kind of impacted by it. So I certainly don't take it for granted, and I think as we continue on in the story, I had some big moments of luck as well, which enabled me to escape. But yes, I was very resilient and incredibly determined.
But I went through such a range of emotions reading the book, and that, you expressed your love for your parents really well, and in particularly that closeness with your father, at significant times and for significant periods. But equally, that I just felt frustrated, and I felt angry, and I felt hurt for the young you, many times. So how have you dealt with that kind of trauma? You must feel frustrated and angry at times, and I mean you were in those days. But man, when you look back at it, how do you work your way through it to become the amazingly successful and wonderful mother and woman and wife and businesswoman and everything that you've done that's been so incredible?
Well, what happened after I escaped from Wavewalker and I got into university was that I packed the whole experience away in the back of my head, really. It's very interesting. I didn't really want to go back and revisit it. So, people would say to me, how did you grow up or where did you go to school? And I had a fairly superficial kind of 2 or 3 sentences that I would say. I kind of grew up on a boat, and then they would go, well, that must be wonderful. And I would go, well, actually, it was a bit more difficult than that. It was quite hard to get an education. And they would go, yeah, I kind of get that. And that would kind of be the end of it. We would have, and I remember having that conversation hundreds of times in my life. And that was about as deep as I really wanted to go as well, because I knew there was a lot more to the story. But I also kind of knew that if I started unpacking it, there was a lot to kind of deal with. And so I was just focused on now rebuilding my life. I wanted to kind of get on and kind of create for myself all the things that I'd missed as a child. I wanted to go and find, educate myself first and foremost, and then kind of find a job. And then I fell in love, and I got married, had kids, and created my own family in a very different way to the sort of family that I'd had as a child. And all the way through this, I kept a superficial relationship with my parents because I felt this huge obligation to kind of do that. And it was only years later when my children got to a similar sort of age to the age where I'd really struggled on Wavewalker that I decided it was time to tell my story. And that was when I went back and looked at all the papers and started to write. And that was when I actually had to confront it. And it wasn't the reason why I started writing Wavewalker, But it was one of the impacts of writing it is I really had to kind of go back and confront it and reassess what I'd been through.
And as a mother, though, I suppose, as you say, it's at that time in your life, but a parent, a mother or a father, what kind of got me as well was I just always thought that parents sacrificed for their kids. You know what I mean? Like, you choose to have them, right? And when you choose to have them, you know that you are you're going to make a lot of sacrifices and you're putting them first. And yet, with all respect, your childhood was the complete opposite.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in my childhood, I struggled to think of a moment where my parents ever put my needs first. When they ever kind of made a kind of a meaningful sacrifice of anything because of something that I needed. My needs were always subsidiary to the things that they wanted to do at every point. I mean, that's just my memory. To the extent that the tiny moments where a little sacrifice was made. Like, I remember my father paying $100 at one point to try and get my kind of schoolwork back. And that was only because I basically begged him. I told him he could take everything I owed. I wouldn't have any presents. I'd give away everything I was given for Christmas if only he would pay to get my school lessons, which had gone to the wrong country because he changed course halfway. I mean, that's kind of it. I just can't remember that. And you're right. It goes completely against how I feel as a parent about my own children. And I think how most people feel about their children. I mean, it's not that, I let my life be dictated by the things that my children want, but that what they require and their needs are a big part of how I make decisions. And I also find it unfathomable how you could have children and then not make their needs at least part of your own priority.
Well, how do you think then that parents can actually weigh up their own dreams against, what their children's needs are?
Well, I think it's all a question of compromise, isn't it? I mean, there's all sorts of ways to have an adventure and to do it whilst balancing your needs and kind of children's needs. So if you take my father's desire to sail around the world, I mean, if he really wanted to do that, of course, there's all sorts of ways to do it, taking account of kind of children's needs. I mean, first of all, you could wait until they got a little bit older and then do it. If you really needed to do it then, you didn't have to take them with you the whole way. We could have gone and joined him in the summers and he could have kind of kept on sailing.
2 or 3 years might have been nice instead of 10.
2 or 3 years might have been quite nice, exactly. Or some legs of it. I don't know. We could have done that. He could have done it in parts. So he could have done a bit with us and then we could have gone back. I mean, all sorts of different things that one could do. So it's not that I think you have to sacrifice and stop everything that you want to do. But I think as a parent, you've got to make compromises because, I think we have an obligation as parents to make sure that our children get an education because otherwise, I mean, I was incredibly lucky, but otherwise your chance of getting on in the world and being able to support yourself become incredibly difficult. But also we have an obligation to, create a situation where our children can have friendships. Socially, when I finally got myself into university, I found it very difficult because my social skills were very underdeveloped because I'd spent a decade at sea and hadn't really had any friends. And I think as a parent, you also want your children to enjoy their childhood. And despite the fact that I lived in paradise a lot of the time in terms of the beautiful places where I was, and I saw some incredible things, as I say, kind of whales and dolphins and phosphorescence and volcanoes and all sorts of wonderful things. Fundamentally, a lot of the time I was incredibly lonely. And I think if I was a parent of a child who was incredibly lonely, I would feel a kind of need to try and fix that and give them, more things that they would enjoy.
Yeah, in some respects, though, your mother made it worse by kind of isolating you and freezing you out, particularly in those troubled teenage years when we can all be a bit difficult. I was bloody awful. But you know what I mean? My like most of us do, my mother forgave me, like 2 minutes later. Whereas yours could go days, couldn't she, with barely acknowledging your presence?
Days, if not weeks, she would go without speaking to me. At times she would call me names and she would kind of belittle me. Really kind of, and now looking back, I think kind of pretty, kind of horrible
Yeah.
kind of emotional tactics on a child that can't get away from you. I've actually spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out why my mother behaved like this, because although I've also been the mother now of a teenage daughter, so I kind of teenage daughters can, sometimes aren't the kind of easiest in the world, although I was a pretty depressed teenage girl, so it wasn't like I was talking back very much or anything. My mother clearly, I think, for whatever strange reason, somehow saw me as competing for my father's affections with her, is the only way in which I can somehow explain it to myself. I don't really understand why she should have felt like that, but she clearly did. And she kind of took it out on me on the boat. And what I've realized as I've kind of got older is I'm, of course, not alone in having an incredibly difficult mother. In fact, having shown some of the letters that she wrote to me to a psychologist, I've been also told she sadly kind of passed away now, but, she almost certainly was kind of very, very narcissistic as well. So I'm not alone in having a very difficult mother. But where my situation was particularly difficult is I couldn't get away from her. I was effectively locked up with her, and I couldn't kind of walk away and kind of go to school or go to a friend or anything else. And that for me gets you back to this whole thing about kind of taking children outside of the system. It can be fantastic, but when it's not fantastic, the child can't do anything about it. They're just kind of trapped in this family circumstance. And if that for some reason is a bad family circumstance, it's really difficult.
So in writing this book and sharing your story, so transparently and so openly and honestly, you do say that you were concerned about the impact it would have on your family. Have you seen that kind of impact? As you say, your mother has passed, but have you been able to reconcile, and did you form a relationship in adulthood?
You mean so with my immediate family?
Yeah.
So what happened is when my parents came back to England, which they did about 3 or 4 years after I went back to go to university, we formed a kind of superficial relationship. I felt this kind of huge social pressure, if you like, to have a relationship with my parents. And also remember, I didn't really know other relatives because we left England for a decade. And so I hadn't grown up with most of my other relatives. So, I knew them a little bit, but not very much. And that was how it went on for years and years. And I kind of got married, had kids. Of course, they then became the kind of grandparents. So you feel this kind of huge obligation as well to maintain a relationship with them. The reason why it took me so long to get round to writing Wavewalker, which I always knew I was going to write because there's a writer inside me and it's a story I just knew I had to kind of tell, was because I was fearful of how they would react when I told the story. When I told my experience of the story, they're not people who at all tolerate any sort of challenge, and that was never allowed on the boat at all. In fact, you were shut down if you tried to kind of talk about things that had gone wrong. So I was fearful, and I say that word kind of honestly. I was honestly fearful of what they would do when I started to write and when they started to realize what I was doing. And what happened was their reaction when they finally did realize that I was going to kind of tell the story from my perspective was much worse than I expected. My mother suddenly kind of passed away. But by that point, she had realized I was kind of writing my book, but she had a sudden and unexpected kind of heart attack. And she left behind a very, very nasty letter that she'd been in the process of writing to me because she was so angry that I was writing my book. She hadn't read it. So, she must have known what had happened, as it were. She must have known in some part of her head that when I wrote kind of what happened on Wavewalker, that it wouldn't look good because, I for all the years of telling me that how fantastic it had been, she must have known differently, if you like. And then my father, I remained very fearful of how he was going to respond, because my father can be a very aggressive and quite kind of violent man at times. And in the end, what happened was in 2019, he demanded that I should stop writing. And when I said I wouldn't, I had every right to tell my story, he kind of stormed out of my house, and I haven't seen him since, and neither of my children. So at one level, that's incredibly sad. But at another level, I feel this was a decision that they both made, that they couldn't tolerate me ever kind of telling the truth about what had happened on Wavewalker. And I feel very happy that I have. I mean, as a person, I feel like a huge weight has lifted off my shoulders. I now have told the story. I've met so many other people who had some sort of version of this experience, usually on dry land, thankfully, rather than at sea. And I feel I feel really kind of happy about that. And I've lost the relationship in particular with my father, and I'm not very close to my brother either, who had a very different experience on Wavewalker. But I'm very close to my kind of husband's family. I've got lots of kind of friends, and I have my kind of lovely kids as well. So I'm very happy with where it all kind of worked out. I'm sad that it had to come to that, but I feel so, so pleased that this story is out there now. And so kind of, as I say, it does feel like a huge weight is lifted off my shoulders.
Well, I have to say, sometimes when dysfunction walks out the door and doesn't come back, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, that is another thing that you realize in life, isn't it? You kind of suddenly realize that you don't have an obligation to have a relationship with people if they're not kind to you.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, before we go, I feel like we have a responsibility to tell people how you got from New Zealand to university, because that is extraordinary in itself. So you had passed your junior certificates, you were studying for your senior ones while you were in New Zealand. You had met a wonderful, who was the junior one? Was it, what was his name? Brian, who was doing the correspondence with you? Who was that teacher that you'd formed that with?
So I had this amazing teacher at the correspondence school called Roger. And, there's a wonderful little story there where I actually went back to find him when I was writing the book. And I discovered that he had polio as a child and actually couldn't walk very well. And that was a real moment for me, because I realized that in all of my troubles, when I was desperately trying to escape from Wavewalker and then kind of get to university when I was abandoned in New Zealand, I'd never even thought to ask what Roger's circumstances were and how he ended up being a teacher at this correspondence school. But I owe him a huge amount, because he was the one who really encouraged me to keep going and encouraged me to apply to university. So the story there is, sitting in that kind of batch, overlooking Lake Rotoriti, I wrote to every university I'd ever heard of in the world. And that ended up being a lot of the very elite universities. And that's not because I thought I was particularly elite. They're just the ones that I knew, because I didn't have any of the addresses. So I I obviously wrote to Auckland University, and I wrote to Sydney, but I also wrote to Harvard University and Oxford and Cambridge and London. I can't remember the others, but I sent off about 10 letters. And in all of the letters, I said, look, I've kind of grown up on a boat for 10 years. I've taught myself. I really want to study zoology or biology. Please, will you consider me? And I'm afraid Auckland wrote back and said, because I wasn't a New Zealander, they couldn't consider me. And Sydney wrote back and said the same, because I wasn't Australian. Harvard never wrote back. I now realize that Harvard University, Harvard America is not the right address. So I don't know whether they actually got my letter.
Let's presume they didn't.
Let's presume they didn't. Anyway.
But Oxford did. And they gave you an opportunity, right? And you took it.
I did. So they wrote back, said, write 2 essays and we'll think about it. I wrote them 2 of the craziest essays in the world, partly deliberately, I thought if I write 2 standard essays here, I've got no chance of competing against somebody who's in a normal school, who can go to a library. So anyway, and then they said, if you can get yourself back to the UK, we'll interview you. So I went kiwi fruit picking near kind of Lake Rotoiti, earned enough money with a small contribution from my father, and got myself a one-way ticket back to the UK. And again, I look back at that moment and I think, I don't know why I wasn't more petrified than I was, because this was my one bet. It was a one-way ticket. I had no way of coming back. Anyway, nothing to come back to. I mean, I couldn't go back on the boat again and live with my mother again. So I was making a one-way bet. If that didn't work, I didn't have a plan B. But I don't remember being petrified, partly because I didn't think I had any choice.
You had nothing to lose. You had nothing to lose.
I had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose at all. And so I did the interview, and incredibly, I now realize, and I know my tutor quite well, that the woman who made the decision, Marion Dawkins, they basically played a wild card and let me in and said, we're going to ignore the fact that you don't have a normal education. We're going to ignore the fact that you don't have qualifications. We're just going to take a bet on you and let you in. And they did. And that changed my life. It really, really changed my life.
Well, there's a message in that for people listening to it is give people a chance, right? And you just never know, because many of them will really surprise you. Suzanne, I'm just so grateful for your time, for your honesty, for sharing your story. We are looking forward to welcoming you back into Auckland. The book, for those listening, is called Wavewalker. I cannot recommend it highly enough. As I say, I just kind of thought I was going to whip through and skim it, and I just found myself absolutely mesmerised, going through a range of emotions, thoroughly enjoying it, and also being quite flabbergasted, but admiring you hugely, Suzanne. So thank you for sharing that with us. Have a great time in Auckland. We look forward to seeing you in person.
I can't wait. I love New Zealand. I brought my kids back when I was writing the book, and we went to Rotorua, Lake Rotoiti, and all the other places I went to. I love New Zealand. It's a fantastic place. So I can't wait. Can't wait.
We are really looking forward to seeing you. And that's it for another episode of Ask Me Anything. You can get in touch with me by emailing askpaula@nzherald.co.nz. Feel free to send me through your questions for the podcast, any thoughts you have. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Make sure you follow Ask Me Anything on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Paula Bennett. Ask Me Anything. Goodbye.